Hello and welcome to this video about In Defense of Gentle Parenting, where I will be talking about why gentle parenting is not the cause of behavioral issues in children. And so to start out, just to give a quick overview as to what gentle parenting is. So this type of parenting does value a more open communication style. And so rather than having rules be, enforced without any questioning, any reasoning, this parenting style values a more open kind of communication where a child's emotions are valued and their inner experience is valued in that relationship. The reason for the making of this video is actually because there has been many sort of reactions circulating around the internet in which when a child is having some kind of behavioral issue in public or something of that sort, a common reaction is to think that the child isn't being disciplined enough, that maybe they're spoiled and they require more punishment. And so the reason for the making of this video is to address these kinds of claims and talk about the actual source of behavioral issues, which in my opinion stem from, they tend to be more foundational issues that either stem from role modeling and the lack of positive role modeling, as well as exposure. And then the second point will have to do with neglect. And so without further ado, let's head into the main part of the video. Alright, so to start out with the first point that has to do with role modeling and exposure. And so obviously we do know that children do have pretty underdeveloped brains. Their frontal cortex, which controls, decision making and reflection, risk evaluation, their frontal cortex aren't very developed, and so they tend to not have a very good filtering system. Children tend to just see something and then just adapt it in their behavior without actually thinking about it, which is why role modeling is so incredibly crucial, as well as all the elements of exposure, what a child is exposed to in their everyday life, whether in terms of online, what they're exposed to online, as well as in school, for example. And so one of the most common situations I find when a child is having some kind of behavioral issue is that there does very, very often tends to be some kind of negative role modeling figure in their life. It may not be intentional, it may not be in in incredibly large ways. However, oftentimes children that do have behavioral issues often do have a parent that similarly has an inability to sort of process their emotions in healthy manners, has unhealthy coping mechanisms, has unhealthy ways of dealing with people in different kinds of spaces. And oftentimes children do take after all of those traits, and sometimes the parent doesn't really realize the kind of effect that their own behavior might be having on their child. But it's an incredibly common kind of situation where a child's behavioral issues are not appearing out of thin air, but are actually mimicking somebody very close in their life. And oftentimes it tends to come from adults. I think something that I commonly perceived is that oftentimes a lot of parents always want to look at a child's friend group, which, don't get me wrong, that can be obviously that can be a source of something, but typically children are all in the same situation in the sense that for the most part none of them know any better. All of them have underdeveloped brains, are still learning, growing, developing, making mistakes. It's typically up to the adults in the life to actually be the leading role models. And so I think one place that parents sometimes don't tend to look is themselves. They don't tend to look at their own way of dealing with situations, their own way of dealing with people, their kind of coping mechanisms. And oftentimes children do very much look up to their parents and to the adults in their life so as to learn how to develop and grow themselves. Now, the second aspect, which I think is my most prominent point, is the aspect of neglect. I think that oftentimes when we think of parental responsibilities, one of the main things we think of is physical responsibilities. We may even think of emotional responsibilities, like ensuring that a child is loved and accepted. But one of the things that we often don't speak about enough is the aspect that children are obviously they need help and guidance in their development. One of the responsibilities of adults is to actually guide a child into developing properly, into understanding how to interact socially, how to place themselves within the world, how to be responsible, how to respect others, how to understand the respect that is owed to themselves, how to understand what to tolerate from others. These are all things that children don't really come instantly knowing, and so it really does play into the parents' responsibility to role model, how to interact within the world, but also trying to teach them all of those aspects of life. And I think oftentimes what gets chalked up as a child who, might just be spoiled or is ungrateful or doesn't experience enough discipline or enough punishment, oftentimes it's actually a child that hasn't received any guidance and is actually very heavily neglected. It's something that I think people struggle to have empathy for sometimes, because it doesn't tend to be as visible, whereas physical or verbal abuse can be very, very visible. What we don't tend to see as much and have as much empathy for is the child that is being misguided. It's a child that isn't receiving proper role modeling and is being sort of left to fend for their own development. And in those kinds of situations, unfortunately, when we're talking about the aspect of punishment might cause like a surface level shock that might cause a certain kind of behavior to disappear for a short period of time. But if the child doesn't have a foundation of good teaching, proper role modeling, and all of those things of that kind, if a child doesn't have that strong foundation, no amount of punishment is going to build a character that hasn't been nourished or has not been nourished or fostered into existence. And another thing to understand is that, as I think I said before, kids don't really understand context. They don't really understand risk evaluations. And so whereas an adult can sort of understand that a behavior might be sort of maybe tolerated in one area and not in another, a child can't really understand those things. That's why oftentimes, obviously adults try to shelter their child from certain behavior. But I think it's very much important to reiterate, because certain behaviors, like for example, driving recklessly, yelling and swearing, things like that an adult might do like in a very specific kind of circumstance where they think that it might be warranted based off of whatever evaluation they've made in their own mind. The problem is that a child does not have that same filtering system. A child does not understand how to evaluate risk. Their frontal lobes are not developed. They're not equipped to be dealing with that kind of decision making. And so the problem is that whatever the child sees, it will tend to manifest in their behavior. And I think ultimately it tends to boil down to a question of balance. The less a child receives intentional attention, guidance, direction, positive role modeling, the more that even very small exposures to certain kinds of behaviors, to certain kinds of worlds online, whatever the case may be, the more that those small exposures will have an impact on who they develop into. And so that's something to keep in mind. It very much is a question of balance. Like, yes, we can't control to the fullest extent, everything that a child is exposed to. However, the more that a child has the tools on how to deal with those exposures and is being taught, about how to exist within the world, the complexity of the world, how to interact with it, how to react when things don't go their way, how to react to bad situations, how to interact with people, what to expect, these are all things that need to be taught. And so the more that is lacking, the more that, even small exposures to harmful things can sort of tip the scales. Now, I would like to bring an example that I actually only noticed, I think it was yesterday while reading this book. I was reading Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which obviously is like very much, we're talking about like the epitome of, bad authority figures, harmful, negative role modeling to the point where it's even a bit caricature-like. But one of the examples that stood out to me while I was reading this is, so one of the characters in the story, which is Miss Havisham, she is somebody that is really, clinging to the past. She's clinging to remnants of the past. She's having trouble accepting the passing of time. She's having trouble adapting to a different kind of role that she can take as a person. And what we see in the way that she's interacting with her niece Estella. And so Estella is a little bit, she's growing to be a bit, at least as of now, a bit bullying, a bit, she has harmful behaviors towards Pip. And one of the things that we see is Miss Havisham telling Estella explicitly that she is her pride and joy and to continue harming Pip. And so that's something that just sort of stood out to me, because I think Estella, in this kind of situation, Estella would be a classic example of somebody whom I think would be considered to be spoiled. I think her behavior, her harmful behavior towards others, would be perceived as somebody who, has too much and hasn't experienced, enough proper discipline. I think that's something that, people tend to perceive. But in this situation, it's so incredibly clear that the person who is supposed to be the role model for Estella is not, is actually encouraging her to be harmful. In terms of the reasoning for it, I'm not quite sure for the moment, but it could be that Miss Havisham is living vicariously through her niece Estella, and is maybe trying to live out some kind of revenge that she's been longing for over something that happened to her, or the loss of something. But nonetheless, Miss Havisham is somebody who treats people, especially people whom she sees as common and somewhat beneath her, she treats them, at least for the moment in this book, with not a very great deal of respect. And we see that behavior being very much manifesting in Estella as well. And being that Estella is obviously younger, I think that does play into the way that it manifests. Like, again, I think what a parent teaches a child can manifest in a child in a way that a parent sometimes could not even foresee. And so in general, I just think that Estella, who is acting very harmfully towards Pip, is a very good example of somebody who isn't being guided, who isn't receiving proper role modeling, who isn't receiving proper teaching. And again, I think in these types of situations, we're so quick to think that the person is probably the way that they are because they're spoiled or because they're not punished enough, whereas in reality, the whole entire foundation of having a person that you can look up to and that you can learn from in terms of, how to develop and how to grow into an adult, that whole foundation is lacking. Now, lastly, I would like to finalize this video by talking about why the subject is of such great importance to me. And for me, it has to do with the fact that I think something that the majority of people tend to commonly understand is the fact that, severe harm inflicted throughout one's childhood can lead to a person developing similar behaviors as an adult. It's not that it always happens, but it is a common feature of people that grow up to have certain very harmful behaviors. Oftentimes there's a history of physical, verbal abuse. And so that's something that I think a lot of people can understand, but something that tends to not be as visible to the eye is the subset of people who do not fit into that profile, but still engage in very harmful behaviors as adults. And I think that in those situations, it tends to be chalked up as something just completely arbitrary, when in reality, when I observe it carefully, there seems to be a pattern. It's a kind of neglect that does pass over a lot of people's heads and it's not paid attention to as much, obviously, as much as physical needs, but the neglect of good role modeling and the neglect of proper guidance, the neglect of teaching, the neglect of helping a person develop into somebody who knows how to have a place within the world and interact with other people and what to tolerate from other people. The neglect of all of those teachings tend to be a very common reason as to why people sometimes don't develop properly. And so that was the end of my video. I hope something I said might have shed a little bit of clarity on these types of situations. I just hope that we can all learn to have a little bit more awareness over the different kinds of ways that, many different kind of things can have impact on children. It's not always as simple as something physical or something verbal. It's not always as simple as direct aggression, there are much, much smaller things that tend to have, very nefarious effects. And I just hope we can have like a more awareness over that.